My friends, happy Gaudete Sunday. This is one of 2 days in the entire church year where we wear rose-colored vestments at Mass. We do this in the third Sunday of Advent and the fourth Sunday of Lent. And it's a reminder during both of those penitential seasons to keep our eyes on the glory that is coming. During Advent, we keep our eyes on the nearness of the coming of God. Our Advent wreath is almost completely lit up, and we know that soon we will be celebrating Christmas, the miracle of Emmanuel, of God with us. And today the church exhorts us to tap into that joy that comes from knowing the nearness of God. And so today we celebrate with gladness and joy, for among us is the great and holy one of Israel, as we sang in our psalm this morning. Now I thought it would be nice to share with you the fact that, in our church, we have patron saints for everything under the sun. We also have a patron saint for joy. His name is Saint Philip Neri, and his story is quite amazing. He was a 16th century priest who lived in Rome and spent his entire life working with the young people and the poor in the city of Rome at a very tumultuous time in the life of the church. When you look at artwork of him, he's often depicted with a big smile on his face, surrounded by young people and the poor. And he just exudes joy. He was known for his kindness, for his great sense of humor. He often did really funny things and kept people guessing. But that's how he became known as the patron saint of joy. What's interesting about Philip's life, though, is that it wasn't always like that. Joy did not come naturally to him, nor did it come easily to him. As a young man, Philip was plagued with scrupulosity. He was very worried about sin, and so he had this really inordinate sense of his unworthiness before God. Now, we're all unworthy before God, but Philip took it to the extreme. And this caused a lot of grief and pain in him. He had doubts early on about God's love for him, and he even felt abandoned by God at times. Now, if you know the lives of the saints, this is not altogether uncommon. This is something that many of them share. But Philip really felt it. In fact, as an early priest, he even felt so overwhelmed by his inadequacies, and a dourness had taken over him that he wondered if he might not leave the priesthood and find some relief from that. But one day while he was at prayer, he had an overwhelming experience of the nearness of God in his life. And Philip could hear the words of God speaking to his soul, "You will make me a joyful priest." And everything changed for him from that point onward. He wasn't immediately filled with giddiness or happiness. In fact, a lot of the same things that he had going on in his life were still there. But that did present a reset for him. He knew, one, that God was near, and two, that joy was not something that just happened to you. It is something that you had to choose, something that you had to will. And my friends, today, Philip, as well as all of our readings today, bring us into the responsibility that we have as Christian people of choosing joy every day of our lives. Now, when we talk about choosing joy, we're not talking about the bumper stickers that people will have, right? Like, look on the bright side, the cup is half full rather than half empty. That's neither here nor there. And in fact, some of that can ignore the real difficulties that come with living this life. All around us, there are many things that we could become very sorrowful, very sad about. But Christian joy is not the absence of sorrow. Christian joy is the presence of something, which can coexist with all of the other things that we have going on in our lives. Christian joy is not a passive reality, it's a choice, and it comes from love. It's a byproduct, a fruit of love. Where there is love, there is God. And where there is God, there is joy. Joy is that elation of the soul that knows its situatedness with God and with others. It's the soul that knows that it is loved, and the soul that is good at loving as well. So let's look at our readings today. We hear from the prophet Zephaniah, "Shout for joy, sing joyfully, be glad and exult with all your heart." Zephaniah, how can I rejoice with all of my heart when in my heart there's sin, there's sadness, there's grief, there's pain, there's fear? Zephaniah doesn't care. He says, rejoice always. We've got to find a way to be able to be joyful at all times. St. Paul reiterates this in his second reading today to the Philippians, where he says, rejoice in the Lord always. And then he repeats himself. He says, I shall say it again, rejoice. It's not an option. If what we mean by this is sit around passively waiting for good things to happen and to then be excited about them, then count me out. I can't do that. But if we are receiving an invitation, and it's more than an invitation, it's a command. If we are receiving a command today to be joyful, it's because we are being told that we need to go out and get really good at love. We need to let God love us, first and foremost. And a lot of us are really bad at that. And that's one of the reasons I think why we struggle with joy. We've convinced ourselves that we're despicable and unlovable, and so God becomes the policeman in the sky that we're trying to appease, rather than the Father who has given us all things. When we situate ourselves in the Father's love for us, we will find our joy. But even that won't make us complete in our joy, and we won't have the ability to rejoice always, because even that is only one part of the deal. What is the more interesting question in the Christian life is, if God is loving me, how and to what extent am I loving God? And by extension, my neighbor. If there's a deficit of love in my life, love that is pouring forth for me, then I can't expect that I'm going to be able to be joyful always. I will feel trodden down and burdened. Notice in our gospel today, John the Baptist is probably the most joyful man the people of Israel have seen up to this point. And it's not because his life is perfect. I mean, he's running around in the wilderness with camel skin, eating bugs and wild honey, and he probably stinks. And I mean, he doesn't have a lot going on for him, but he is so joyful. Why? Because John knows the Lord is near. And just as in the moment when he leapt in his mother's womb at the nearness of the coming of Christ, who was in his mother's womb at that point, John has been on fire, stirred up with the love of God. And yet he encounters some people in our gospel today who they're not there. They're struggling with this experience of joy. They come to him, the crowds, and they're like, John, what are we going to do? How can we have the joy that you have? And he says, it's easy. You got to love. You got to love. What does this look like? Well, for example, if you have 2 cloaks and you know that somebody doesn't have one, give that cloak to them. But how's that going to make me joyful? Well, objectively, giving your coat to somebody is not going to make you joyful. Loving them is going to make you joyful. It's going to fill you up. If you do this out of love, these things will make you whole, and you will find joy. Then you have the tax collectors, right? Like the most miserable people in existence. They've exhorted their people to the point where everybody hates them, and they come to them and they're like, John, what do we do? And John says, stop extorting your people. Love them. Don't take more than what is prescribed. And then the soldiers come, and John, what do we do? And John's like, you've got to love. You've got to stop doing the things that you're doing that is bringing love out of the world and bring more love into the world. And my friends, we're not talking about, again, love or joy as these bumper sticker ideas. We're talking about real, true, sacrificial love, where I put the needs of another, the honor of God, the honor of another human being, their good, ahead of my own. And in doing that and laying myself down in these little moments, rather than looking at the world as something to conquer and for me to get as much out of it as I can, I end that cycle of constantly seeking the next fix. I end the cycle of constantly trying to eke out my own happiness. And paradoxically, by giving of myself, by loving, I find my happiness and my joy. That's what today is all about. And it's so easy and so simple to talk about, but so difficult to enter into. But we all have the ability to. Because one, God loves us. And that is not me just being some, fluffy priest on a Sunday morning in church. The creator and sustainer of all reality wills you in existence right here and right now. If he ever stopped caring about you, if he ever stopped thinking about you, if he ever stopped desiring your good, you would just cease to exist. So the very fact that you exist means that God loves you so much you can't even imagine. But Father, I'm a sinner and I've done awful things. Yeah, okay, that's something that we got to deal with. But it doesn't start in any other place than the radical, lasting love of God. When you're struggling with sin, it has nothing to do with God not loving you, and everything to do with your struggle with loving God. And that's why we have the church, to help to situate us in that reality, and through living a life of faithfulness, living a life of penance, living a life of sacrifice, living a life of giving ourselves over to God, that we learn to love him as he has loved us. And we learn to love each other as he has called us to love one another. This is the project of our Christian life. And if we don't get love figured out and soon, we're going to keep going to all of the things in this life and in this world that we think are going to make us happy that will not make us happy. Or they will for a time and then leave us wanting more. That's not joy. Joy is never a passive experience. Joy is never something that just happens to us. Sometimes the people who are the most sorrowful in this life can be the most joyful because they know the nearness of God. That is what we are celebrating in just a week's time. The nearness of God, his immediacy in our lives, born for us in time in Bethlehem, born for us anew in grace in the life of the church, especially in the Most Holy Eucharist, and born for us every single moment of our existence in our hearts. We don't have to look any farther to anything or any reality outside of that to find the source of our joy. And today we are invited, we are commanded to tap into it, to find it, to live in it, and to choose it. And if Dour Philip Neri can discover this and become the patron saint of joy, you and I can too. So my friends, on this third Sunday of Advent, this Gaudete Sunday, let us hear these words today and incorporate them in every facet of our being. Rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always. I shall say it again. Rejoice.